Okay, I was cut off there, but to continue talking about the way in which the Imperial Palace and the Forbidden City is structured, as I mentioned, it stresses harmony. You go in through a gate that leads you through the Gate of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Complete Harmony, and the Hall of Preserving Harmony. The palace where the emperor will reside is known as the Palace of Heavenly Purity. So again, it is very much stressing that the emperor is a sort of divine presence, or at least semi-divine presence. And that leads to it becomes sort of self-reinforcing. That is that the more the emperor stays hidden and attains his reputation as being someone who is sort of divine and mystical, the more the emperor has to stay hidden. And this is sort of the problem with this kind of structure being used to justify authority and to justify rule, that it ultimately imprisons the ruler, almost quite literally. That is, that it causes or it makes it so that the ruler can no longer, in essence, interact with his or her people, because to do so may dispel or may disturb the carefully crafted idea that the emperor is somehow not quite human. That is, to bring the emperor out, to have the emperor meet the subjects, is to risk people saying, well, the emperor looks just like me, or the ruler seems just like just another person. So by building this and by stressing the sort of seclusion of the emperor and the mystery around the emperor, they actually created some problems. Or Yonglow's legacy was somewhat more problematic than perhaps he had intended. Yes, it does give this air of mystical authority to the emperor, but it also places the emperor at a disadvantage. That is, the emperor is no longer as easily able to stay in touch with the people. The emperor becomes dependent on those who advise him, those who can control the flow of information that reaches him. And one of the things that happens, starting really in the middle of the 1400s and then escalating quickly through the 1500s, is that as the emperor becomes more and more a creature of the imperial palace and the Forbidden City, someone who basically knows no world beyond its boundaries, the emperor's advisors begin to rival each other and begin to compete among each other for who will have the ear of the emperor, who will be the one responsible for giving the emperor information, and how they can use that position to further their own political or oftentimes financial positions. That is, these advisors will use the emperor or advise the emperor to do certain things, to appoint certain people, they will basically bring a new sort of corruption into the imperial palace and into the Forbidden City. That is, they will advise the emperor as to what they see going on in his territories and suggest solutions that will benefit perhaps them, or at least benefit their friends and relatives and clients. What happens is that in the provinces in particular, people whom the emperor appoints, he's no longer able to necessarily control or even understand what they're doing. In the countryside, by the early 1500s, you have provincial officials who are more intent on collecting taxes than they are on spending money on agricultural improvements, as Hongwu had done, for example. You have provincial landowners, provincial bureaucrats, and governors who begin to build up almost their own private armies. So it's a destabilizing element within the context of Ming rule. That is, the Ming dynasty is going to go through some severe stresses in the 15 and 1600s. Among other things, there will be a huge rise in prices, inflation, due largely to a huge influx of money that is being mined by the Spanish in Central and South America, increasing the flow of silver and other precious metals around the world, contributing to rising prices throughout the world. But the big problem is the fact that the emperor has now become, in essence, captive to the imperial mystique. The emperor is now limited very much to what he can gather from advisors and what sort of information gets to him in this very sort of secluded position. So by attempting to create this real sort of theater of power, the Emperor Yonglo wound up ultimately hampering the ability of the emperor to rule by making the emperor's position dependent upon his semi-divine status, which was dependent, therefore, upon, which was thus dependent upon his continued seclusion. What Yongle did is he removed the emperor from politics, and he removed the emperor from the day-to-day workings of the empire. So it's a very sort of careful line that these rulers have to tread. They have to figure out a way in which they can establish and justify their authority, but they also have to do so in a way that allows them to maintain at least some touch with those they govern. That is, that rule cannot be accomplished. Hongwu understood this. We'll talk about the Emperor Akbar in India in the next lecture. But successful emperors have realized that they cannot depend simply on force and coercion and sort of impression to get people to abide by their rule, but there has to be a little bit of reciprocity. There has to be a little bit of a buy-in, a little bit of an acceptance and even an embrace of their rule as a good thing by, if not all the people, at least a significant number of the people. And part of that is creating at least the impression, or at least the sense that the emperor is in some ways concerned in people's lives, or concerned in how people live their lives. Not in a sort of an intrusive way, but is there to support economic change in particular, there to support existing social relationships, existing and traditional practices. If the emperor becomes too far removed or too far remote, then this reciprocity or this sense of an imperial presence in people's lives disappears, and that's when the power of the emperor begins to disappear as well. So we've seen Hongwu, who has a lot of advantages, come in and use these advantages, especially his military background and his very sort of specific history as the founder of the Ming Dynasty, to bolster his own rule. And we've seen how Yongle wrestles with this question of justifying his authority and ultimately settles on ways of displaying power, using the tribute system, using the construction of an entirely new capital, Beijing, to try to establish himself. He's successful in establishing himself as the emperor and establishing the position of the emperor during his reign, but he leaves a problematic legacy for his successors. And that after he is gone, neither the tribute system is maintained, nor is regular contact or interaction or reciprocity maintained between the emperor and his people. So this is the sort of wrap-up we're doing. This gives you an idea of a couple more things. This is the imperial throne at Beijing, again designed to impress and to awe. An overview of the imperial city. And finally, this is the temple of heavenly purity, the largest temple, and basically where the emperor spent most of his time, just to give you a sense of how big and how significant the Forbidden City and the imperial city as a whole was. We will turn next time to talking about how Akbar, the Mughal emperor, whose forebears lead a successful conquest of northern India in the early 1500s, how Akbar is able to consolidate that conquest and able to bring rule and to justify his authority while facing what you might say are very different challenges than those that Hongwu and his successors faced in China. So thank you for this, and the next lecture, the next class focus will be on Akbar and Mughal India. Thank you.